so James and I were talking, and we talk often on the phone about stuff and theology stuff, church stuff, and all that. But one of the things that we've been talking about a lot recently that I've been really interested in, given a bunch of particular things that have been going on Twitter and church and books and stuff like that, is the idea of theology. And when I was in high school, it was called religious studies. We didn't even have theology; it was called religious studies. And so what I wanted to do is just briefly share with you guys some thoughts, some introductory remarks concerning the nature of theology. What is theology? And how should we do it? That's the name of this talk. Now, when this might seem like an extremely basic question, and that's part of the problem, is that the question of what is theology is often overlooked by even theologians themselves. Many people just assume that they know what theology is, and so they just sort of skip the question of actually looking at the science of theology. But unfortunately, fortunately, that was not true for guys like Thomas Aquinas and Augustine and even St. Paul, when they really thought about what does it actually mean to be doing this thing called theology. Now, the word theology actually is just a combination of two Greek words, theos and logos. And the words basically, theos comes from the word, just the Greek word for God. And then logos comes from the Greek word, which means just reason or word. So basically what we're doing from the Greeks, when we use that word theology, we're borrowing from the Greeks, and it usually has this connotation. It almost always has this connotation that what you're doing is you're reasoning about God. Okay. But before I go in to talk a little bit more about that, let me go back to the point that I was making earlier, which is that theology is often, that question about what is the nature of theology is often overlooked, because again, it seems like such a simple question. It's assumed that we know what it is. So then we just sort of move on. For me, in my Bible class, my scripture class, I take almost a week, 2 weeks to go over the question of what is theology. And it's not as simple as many people would like us to believe, for the following reasons. There is no such thing really as theology in the New Testament. I mean, we get this idea that Paul wants us to renew our minds, to have the same mind of Jesus Christ. There is something about thinking about God, but it's not in terms of just pure reason. Okay, like you're proving God's existence with the 5 proofs of Thomas Aquinas, or you're looking at God's attributes, or you're trying to figure out what God's attributes are. It's actually much more difficult than that, because I was talking with a famous theologian the other day on the phone, and I pointed out in Summa Contra Gentiles, which is just a book that Thomas Aquinas wrote, and he has, and this is the title of at the end of it, it's the title of a book I'm drafting on theology itself. But Thomas says that if man was left to just reason, just logos, to think about God, man would remain, Thomas says, quote, man would remain in the blackest shadows of ignorance. The blackest shadows of ignorance. Now, the reason why I hold on to that is because many times we think that it's just easy to, we know that God exists. We can prove it by proof 1, proof 2, proof 3, and so on and so forth. We know that God is utterly simple. We know what his attributes are, and so on and so forth. The problem is, as Thomas says, even at the beginning of the Summa, that most people don't have time to figure that stuff out. And it takes a long time to figure it out. Plus, you got to be smart, super smart. And after you have someone super smart, someone that is able to live for 400 plus years and is able to think about this full time without having to do, there would still be tons of errors in it. That's not me. That's Thomas. Okay, so so we have to step back and say, when we get this word theology, which is coming to us from the Greeks, we have to be careful with saying that theology is just merely man using his reason alone. And what I mean by reason is philosophical reason. Okay? Because there's another sort of reason that's sort of being oftentimes left out. Okay. So let me pause there for a second and say that the question surrounding what is theology has a much more fundamental question, and that is how can we know stuff about God? How can we know God? And so, like we already said earlier, it's not enough to just say, well, I can sit down and think about these philosophical thoughts and come up with a syllogism and think them perfectly into existence, and I can know about God. That's Thomas and the Catholic tradition believes that there needs to be something more. There's something missing. Now, let me say this. There's a famous line in Catholic theology that's pulled from Thomas and other great thinkers, which is grace builds on nature. And oftentimes that gets translated into sort of like a spiritual theology, that grace builds on nature, that God takes the nature and then through baptism sort of brings it into his own life, Galatians 4:4-9. But it's not just that. Grace builds on nature and it perfects it and heals it in the theological realm. And so it's not just enough to have logos. You also have to have grace and revelation that not only, catch this is super important, not only tells us about the Trinity, but also purifies and protects our reason from error. So whatever God's attributes are, because here's the thing. Oftentimes when you dive into a thing like the Summa, right? It's like everybody thinks it's just Thomas doing reason. He's just trying to figure out whether or not God is composed of parts and whatever. But even when he's talking about the attributes, he will never just go to his reason. He doesn't even begin there. He always cites a text from Scripture, for the most part, actually, not always. He cites a text from Scripture and then shows how reason makes sense of that text from Scripture. So what is theology then? It's not just reasoning about God from the philosophical point of view. It's also reason coming into contact and being purified by revelation. So why is all of this important? Reason and revelation. Why is it all important? Because a firestorm broke out at the end of the 19th and in the middle of the 20th century. It's still with us today. This question concerning what is theology, and the reason why I've gotten really into it in the last several months was just because many people on Twitter call them so-called trads, who think that Thomas is mainly a philosopher when that wasn't what he is. He never considered himself a philosopher at all. He wasn't even close to a philosopher. He was a theologian, but he wasn't just a theologian. He was a biblical scholar. He's a biblical theologian. The primary texts that he wrote were commentaries on Scripture. The Summa was never something he ever taught in class. He never taught out of the Summa, ever. He never brought it in class. When he signed up to teach classes in the fall or the winter or the spring, he got to choose. These were the class options: Gospel of Matthew, Gospel of Luke, Gospel of John, 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, Romans, 1 Thessalonians. He had to pick a book from the Bible, and that was theology. You gave a commentary on Scripture. You couldn't teach introduction to philosophy. There was no introduction really to theology. There was no fundamental theologies over here, moral theology over here, pastoral theology. No, you had a book of the Bible and you read it and you commented on it.
Can I interject, Chris, real quick?
Yeah.
This is interesting. I like this point because it definitely highlights that Thomas Aquinas isn't just a big brain trying to reach out to God. So often when you look at anything in the Summa or anything, even in his commentaries, and then in his lectures, there are some lectures we still have, or his sermons, the most authoritative or the most important points he makes are the ones where he cites Scripture, or if he's not citing Scripture, he's citing the tradition where like Augustine or Bede or Chrysostom, they're citing Scripture. It's very powerful, right? It's super powerful.
Yeah, no, it's very powerful, and he even says in there that only the canon of the canonical scriptures suffice. He says sola scriptura something canon, whatever it is in Latin, and it's not like he's sola scriptura like the Protestants. He's just saying scriptures are the inspirated source of theology, And the church fathers, he says, are probable arguments. So and when you have a consensus, then you want to go with that consensus. But on them, in and of by themselves, the church fathers are illuminating the sacred text. But it's the living tradition of the church that that is also going to help the church's dogmas. That's going to help the illumination of the sacred page. But the object is the sacred page. And here's why this is important. Any science that you're going to study, okay, the question is, what is your object and what is the method? And usually the object is determined by the method. Okay, so the material, you have a material object, formal object, and all this. I'm not going to get too specific here, but like if your material object of the thing that you're studying is man, okay, so you're studying man. Well, if you're studying man under the formal object of his body, you're studying man in his body, then that science is anatomy. If you're studying man within through the formal object of as a living being, that's called biology. If you're studying man under the formal object of him within his culture, that science is called anthropology. If you're studying man in sociology, that's called sociology. So the formal object defines sort of what science you're doing. Now, here's the tricky part, okay? Well, catch this because it's going to come at you fast. In theology, what is the object that we're studying? It's God. But this is super key. With the revelation, with the fulfillment of the ancient oracles of the Old Testament in Jesus Christ, the material object has now shifted. This is key. And you're not just studying God, you're studying Jesus Christ. Okay? You're studying Jesus Christ. So therefore, your method is supernatural faith, because that's what he's revealing to us, supernatural mysteries. And the formal object by which you study that is the sacred page illuminated by the tradition of the church. So this is really key. Thomas was not merely a philosopher. And I'll tell you why the 5 proofs are really popular. It's because of a thing called rationalism that was in the 19th century and even beyond that. And it's crept all the way up into our own day, which is this idea that everything should be able to be proved by reason. So the very fact that God is 3 in 1, we should understand that by reason. We should understand it under the domain of reason. Jesus Christ is truly present in the Holy Eucharist. We should understand that by pure reason. And we can't. These are supernatural mysteries of faith. And so the method that was deployed by many people in the 19th century was reason. But reason can't ascertain the supernatural mysteries of faith. Okay? And so this question, and this is what's going on behind the scenes at times like Vatican II and prior to it. The question is what approach, what method, and what system, let's call it a system now, is able to deal with this tension between faith and reason? The answer that the church gave to us was, I'll say this. The answer that eventually comes to us is scholasticism. So scholasticism is the method that the church has officially endorsed as the theological method. Okay, when we're doing theology, what is it we're doing? We're doing the thing that the scholastics were doing. Now, the question then becomes, what were the scholastics doing? And the scholastics, what they were doing will be held off for a second. Okay, I'm just going to put it over there. There was another official response to this idea that the supernatural mysteries of faith could be known by reason. They ought to be known by reason. It's also interesting, by the way, I'll just add this as a quick tangent, that fundamentalism, Protestantism in general, and Islam are on 2 opposite ends of the spectrum, really. Because Islam thinks that basically everything that Catholics believe about the supernatural mysteries of faith are blasphemous. Absolutely blasphemous, because you have God, who is utterly transcendent, coming and taking on the form of a human being and becoming a human being. So they have no ability to understand the supernatural mysteries of faith. Their system, they can't understand how God could reveal supernatural mysteries of the faith. Protestantism, on the other hand, thinks that God can reveal supernatural mysteries of faith, and they can be known by reason once he reveals them. And the tension lies in this idea that the reason really can't comprehend something like the Trinity unless it's infused by God, because the intellect is limited to what the senses perceive, Thomas says. And so because we're limited in what what's coming through the senses, we're going to be limited. We're not going to be able to know what's beyond the senses, what's beyond creation. And so that's how Thomas deals with it. But let me say this: Vatican I was the moment in which the church responded at the end of the 19th century to this rationalism, this idea that the supernatural, that the supernatural mysteries couldn't even be known by reason. But they were also reacting against this Kantianism that sort of, well, it wasn't just Kant, it was other things going on, that it was the Enlightenment, basically, that God's existence couldn't be known, that science has sort of taken over for superstition being the word that was inserted to allow people to easily brush aside revelation and scripture and so on and so forth. God can't be known. And so in Vatican I, the church is reacting against this and says, no, God can be known through creation and through reason. His existence and his attributes can be known.
So our goal is to put on more events like this to help people, to help us all to grow in our knowledge of the faith. And if you'd like to support us, please join our mission. So this is our Patreon page. So we have a podcast. Chris and I just did an interview. I think it was like 2 weeks ago. So we're just trying to put more and more content out to help people grow.